This is SelfWork, and I'm Dr. Margaret Rutherford. At SelfWork, we'll discuss psychological and emotional issues common in today's world and what to do about them. I'm Dr. Margaret, and SelfWork is a podcast dedicated to you taking just a few minutes today for your own self-work. Hello, this is Dr. Margaret Rutherford, and welcome back to SelfWork. I began SelfWork over 4.5 years ago in order to extend the walls of my practice to those of you that were already interested in psychological phenomenon, emotional issues, trauma, whatever. Maybe you're in therapy and would be interested in hearing from another therapist or psychologist. To those of you who've just been diagnosed with something and you're looking for answers, or you're having a relationship issue that you don't understand. But also to a third group, to those of you who might say you never darken the door of a therapist, but you're just curious enough or unhappy enough to listen to SelfWork. Welcome to all of you. In the third of a loose series on careers that kill, today we're talking to Dr. Shauna Springer, or Doc Springer, who's the author of Warrior, How to Support Those Who Protect Us. There are 20 veteran suicides every day in this country. It's not a veteran problem. As Doc Springer says, it's an American problem. She also says the idea that for a veteran, their pain is the fox in their gut, which is based on a Spartan tale, which eats them alive, but they never let anyone see that they're rotting from the inside. She's very down to earth and is known for her brilliant and moving work with first responders and veterans. I found both her and her book really fascinating. A little sneak peek. Interestingly enough, it's not what warriors or first responders see or hear or smell that leads them to depression and suicide. It's actually shame or guilt. And, of course, they have a greater capacity than most since their gun knowledge is so astute, or as they would say, their firearm knowledge. And many continue to own a firearm without realizing that it become a weapon not of protection, but of self-destruction. We'll talk about that as well. To tell you a little more about Doc Springer, she's a best-selling author, frequently requested keynote speaker, and one of the world's leading experts on psychological trauma, military transition, suicide prevention, and close relationships. So you can see why on this Memorial Day weekend, I wanted to feature her work. She's a Harvard graduate who's become a trusted doc to our nation's military warfighters. And she navigates different cultures with exceptional agility. And this was something that I found so true that I talked to her a lot about. She's frequently sourced by the media for uniquely perceptive insights on trauma recovery, post-traumatic growth, psychological health. And her work has been featured in multiple media outlets: CNN, NPR, NBC, CBS, Forbes, Business Insider, Military.com, Coffee or Die magazine, Gun Talk Radio, and on and on and on. So, I welcome Doc Springer. I cannot wait for you to listen in to our conversation on not only depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, but the invisible wounds of our veterans that are killing them. And as always, what they can do about it. Before we get to today's interview, I wanted to introduce one of our sponsors to you, BetterHelp. Doc Springer is going to be talking a lot about getting really good therapy for your veterans, for your military, for your first responders. But many people are finding BetterHelp can be there for you. So take a listen, and there's a special offer from BetterHelp and from me. BetterHelp has now been a sponsor of SelfWork for a few months, and I've been hearing how pleased you are with their services. I couldn't be more excited about that, as by now you know I'm a huge believer myself in the power of therapy. What is BetterHelp? It's an online therapy service that has earned the #1 ranking for the quality of their service to their consumers. When you contact them, you are offered several different licensed professional therapists to choose from, all that have been vetted by BetterHelp. You can have sessions via video, text, or phone. And I found, because of course I checked it out before recommending it to you, that each therapist was very available, literally a text away, and made some of the same therapeutic suggestions to me that I'd offer myself as a therapist. Here's an excerpt from a listener who wrote in. I'm a 23-year-old living in Brazil. I'm only writing this message in order to express my gratitude towards you and your podcast. Having anxiety disorder, I always felt like I needed therapy, but I was too anxious to start it. With SelfWork, not only I've learned some valuable insights about dealing with my condition, but also the basics of how therapy sessions work, which allowed me to finally get some courage to start it. With the coronavirus pandemic, I'd also been concerned about attending personal sessions, but then I learned about BetterHelp in your podcast, and it sounded just perfect for what I needed. I've been getting online counseling from BetterHelp for 6 weeks now, and I feel like it's been helping me a lot. That's just so wonderful to hear. And now BetterHelp has a special offer for you. 10% off the first month of sessions if you use this link. TryBetterHelp.com/selfwork. That's TryBetterHelp, HELP.com/selfwork. I'm never more honored than hearing someone sought therapy after listening to SelfWork. And if SelfWork is helping you, maybe BetterHelp is your next step. You know, Doc, I'm so honored to have you on SelfWork. And as I just told you, I finished an interview with Danica Thomas, who suggested in the first place that we reach out to you on this Memorial Day special episode of SelfWork. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me. And Danica, thank you for suggesting this. I'm happy to be here today.
Well, it's truly an honor. I read your book and the clinician in me was nodding. The learner in me was like, oh, wow, I'd never thought about it like this. Especially the part where you talk about adapting military language and military terminology and military strategy to actual therapeutic technique. I just thought that was incredible. And I was going, yeah. I wanted to start with the analogy at the beginning of the book that says, you know what? Maybe we should first start out by asking you, why are you called Doc? I think that would be a great place to start.
Okay. Yes. So the name Doc is it's one of the biggest honors to me when veterans call me that, because I know that it has real meaning for them. And in my work, I came to understand that there's a difference between a doctor who is somebody who's worked really hard, and gone through a lot of schooling and has a lot of assets, but a doctor and a doc are not the same thing. And a doctor can be a doc, but being a doc is really not about a degree. It's about your approach to practice and your capacity to build the trust so that you hear the roots of what is really going on for your patients.
What in your personal history, and I'm already deviating from what I said I was going to do, what in your personal history made you so interested in working with the military?
It wasn't something I figured out in advance, only in retrospect. So all I knew really at the time that I started first working with military service members and their spouses was that it just felt like home to me. And I didn't understand why. I didn't really evaluate that for a long time. And I'm on a walk with my sister. And I said, why do you think it is that I just connect so well with people who have served in the military? I didn't, we aren't a military family. And she said, well, Mom and Dad raised us like one extended boot camp. And she was right. It really, that conversation, I'll always remember it. It froze in time because, the 5 a.m. runs in the morning around the track. We're 5 years old and, they started us with PT, physical therapy, or physical conditioning, 3 times a week. And we would run in too. So there were all these things that were just very much military type values that I've adopted.
That's really interesting. I'm sitting here thinking about my own mother trying to get out at 5 o'clock. She was a true Southern heels and hose kind of woman. She had to get on her makeup before 4:30 a.m. so nobody would see her without it. So we have very different backgrounds. So now I'll get back to what I said I was going to do. I wanted to start with the analogy at the beginning of the book because it's a thread that runs through the entire book. And if I can quote, hidden pain is like a fox in your gut. Now, this isn't the easiest analogy to hear, but I thought it was really provocative. Can you tell that story?
Yeah. First of all, I love the way you just said it. The way you just read it was spot on what I intended to say with that analogy. And actually, the original title of this book was going to be The Fox in Our Gut, on hidden pain, courage, and love. And then I got some feedback from people that it was kind of without the explanation I give in the book, kind of a gross sounding concept. Maybe what does it even mean? but it's based on the boy of Sparta who puts a fox in his cloak, and the fox starts to eat at his abdomen. And he sits there in plain view of lots of people around him, fellow students and teachers, and doesn't even say a word about it. And he's, eventually he drops over dead. And so there are so many precious people that we are losing. And the reality is most of the time, we don't always know how dangerous it is when they're in that crisis. And so the fox in our gut is really that private pain that we defend and protect and hold to ourselves. And the thing that, if we don't address it, will eat us alive and put us at great risk.
And so when you use that analogy with soldiers, with warriors, how do they respond to it?
Well, it's based on the Spartan culture, which is a very stoic culture. So it's aligned with their values and gives them a reason that makes sense to them as to why they would hold that fox in their gut to themselves, because they're taught, soldier on and don't talk about your own problems. You just suck it up and you just move on. You don't want to be a distraction to everybody else. So it helps them reduce the shame they feel in the sort of why would they do that in the first place. It also gives them a rationale when you can shift their understanding to this fox in a gut that you have is dangerous to you, and it's dangerous to the cohesion of the brotherhood. And it's just an enemy. And it has a voice and it has a strategy, your demons, the voices of your demons, just the word they use for it. And if you understand that, you can get traction with mental warfare. That is a very empowering message for them.
I can hear that loud and clear. In fact, it harkens back to something you said later, which what vets die for is what they would live to protect. In fact, you say that's the most important statement of the book. When we think about post-traumatic stress disorder as being what happens to people when they come away from battle, you talk about, however, there are many, many more invisible wounds of war. And so I would love for you to talk about that again.
Thank you. I love the question, and I might just broaden it a little bit to say that this year, has been a year of trauma for all of us. Insights in Warrior, the reason I'm bringing forward a second edition is because the Insights in Warrior have a lot to teach us about how to navigate a time of trauma like this. I think many of us now understand at a personal, cellular level what it feels like to be chronically faced with trauma. And we're coming out of this year of trauma, of being taught to see each other as possible disease carriers, to be hypervigilant to an invisible threat, to lose loved ones to COVID, suicide, or other causes, and have our grief cut off. These are all things that military service members and first responders have experienced for many years. And if there's any silver lining to this year, it's that we are all, I think, more collectively connected around the impact of trauma and how it can really biologically impact us in our bodies, and how it can impact us in our spirits and in the ways that we navigate life going forward. So that's my heart in this, is to take what I've learned from our warfighters who are exposed to extreme traumas and help us all to navigate this time of so much change and trauma.
What I had written down was that so much treatment, so much focus is on what the soldiers see, or what substances do they use, or what medications they're on, or blah, blah. But you talk a lot about shame and guilt being the real crux of what treatment needs to be about.
Yes, I do, because I think we're missing the things that I saw as most directly connected to mental health battles. We have this myth that it's the things warriors see and do in war, the horrors of war, that are the root of their deepest pain. And that's not it. I think we risk projecting that onto them because we are not trained to go to war. And so to put into a war zone and see those horrifying things might be really traumatizing to us if we're not trained that way. But to war fighters, they aren't necessarily the source of the trauma. And so it's really the guilt and the shame and these moral injuries, survivor guilt, grief. These things were more often at the root of suicide crises and attempts than the horrors of war or the narrative that mental health diagnoses or depression are the things that are most dangerous when it comes to suicide.
I'm thinking about a patient I worked with a long time ago who basically grew up in the country. And he was telling me about these things that had happened to him. One time he was riding a four-wheeler and his whole forehead got ripped off because he went under a roof or something. And me being a city girl, I was like, oh my gosh. And he was like, oh, well, you know, stuff like that happened on the farm all the time. And it just made me think about what you said, what was part of his ordinary experience. And it was exposure to something that I didn't understand. So is it harder for warriors to actually reveal these things, or do they tend to get stuck in telling you the details of what they saw, or is that what they talk a lot about? I wonder if they have to trust the therapist a lot before they begin talking about something else, and you have to earn that trust as a therapist. And so is that something that you think people try to shock you with by telling you some of the things that they saw?
It is for some people, definitely. You know, the first conversation we hear is not, with any patient, always going to be the truth that we need to understand. And I'm sure you've had this experience too, but times, you know, the first conversation or the first disclosure is a test to see whether we can be trusted, to walk through a valley with someone. And so there is that, but there's also, in addition to being tested, I had worked with a number of civilian patients in a successful private practice before I worked with military service members, and they wanted to come see me. They showed up on time, happy to pay a lot of money to talk about the challenges in their lives, get some new insights. Veteran patients, it was very different. And because I had worked with both populations, I had to ask myself, why is it that they seem to be scanning for any reason to never see me again? And then when I traced that idea back, I thought, well, who am I to them coming into this relationship? What experiences have they had with people like me in the military?
That's so interesting. Can you talk a little bit about moral injury? Because that's a concept, again, that runs through the book. And I think it's so important for people to understand. Because I think when I saw it first, I thought, oh, so they feel bad about something they did or something they saw. That was an assumption of mine. And that's what she's talking about. But that's not what you're talking about.
It can be part of moral injury, though. You're not wrong. It's part of moral injury, but the early understandings of moral injury were more like those kinds of things that you said or did something or couldn't do something that was not aligned with your personal morality. In Warrior, I really talked about how I think we need to really expand our understanding of what moral injury is, because it doesn't always involve a discrete act or decision or event, and a situation can conspire to morally injure people. So let's say that you've lost battle buddies, brothers and sisters in arms, whether to training accidents or combat suicide. You've lost a number of irreplaceable people. And then you come out of the military and you struggle, like many people do. A very stressful and chaotic time where people often struggle in transition. What will happen is, if you think about those people who have died, that are no longer with us, you can go back and say, who am I that is worthy? And they never would have struggled like I'm struggling. They never would have yelled at their kids or had a drinking problem, or not been able to hold down a job. And so when I talk about moral injury, it's this bigger concept of how, as moral beings, we compare ourselves to the ghosts of those we lost. It's such an important thing to think about all the warriors of all the eras in this statistic, because many of us do think that, the 20 veterans who died, they, on average, are the veterans of modern conflicts, and most are not. And, with Vietnam veterans, to give you one example, a lot of my Vietnam veterans who had developed cancers, and their psychology around that was very different than civilians that I treated. Civilians might say, well, it was something I made a lifestyle decision about I smoked, I drank, I whatever in some point in my life. And that's why I've got this cancer. Whereas my Vietnam veteran patients would tend to think, I think this is related to Agent Orange or some other, environmental contaminant. And I felt like I had escaped from Vietnam. And I find out now it's come back and gotten me in the end.
So rather than a warrior, is it they feel like a victim? Is that the right word? Is that a good word?
Yeah, that I was a captive there. And then I got free. It came to get me in the end.
Okay, this is a bit of a loaded subject in this day and time, but I'd still like to go there. I want to talk about how the military feel about firearms. You made a huge point, which I'd never considered, that we in the civilian public do not understand how the military feel about firearms.
And it's not everybody in the military. I mean, there are some of my patients that never wanted to touch a firearm again after their time in the military, but for many of them, it's a matter of their identity to own, to control, to be given the trust of our society to wield their firearms for protective reasons in the service of all of us. And they're firearms experts. They get a lot of training, and they're not people that you'll see doing things like you would see in, movies that are just with no safety precautions at all. They are tending to be very careful and very safety conscious. But the risk that is in their blind spot is that they never think about how sometimes in an overwhelming time of stress or trauma, a firearm that was originally purchased for protection of their family, of their loved ones, can be turned to a weapon for self-destruction in the mindset. And that's the conversation we need to have in a culturally respectful way.
Are the majority of military or first responder suicides by firearm?
Yes, that is the go-to method for, and it's so much more lethal than other means. And so researchers are right to put emphasis on this, but unfortunately, what can happen is all of the words in the world about how dangerous this is will fall on deaf ears if you don't have the right approach. If you don't come in a respectful, humble way, you lose your patient in terms of them dropping out of treatment or maybe otherwise.
Oh, yeah. I think the point you made was that too many therapists try to talk about firearms far too early, as if trying to assess some kind of danger before they've earned someone's trust. And it feels like to them, you're trying to take something away from me. You also said, and I didn't know this was a fact, but I had no clue 20 veterans die by suicide every day.
Yeah, that's, the latest data. Of course, that kind of is hard to get, but we've lost more to suicide than to combat in the modern wars. So it's a national crisis, but it's not just a veterans issue. It's now become an American issue. Right? It's going to be something that all of us as healers, you, me, and many others are going to need to come together and really understand.
So let's talk for a second about therapy, what really helps. And you've come up with a model that I just found fascinating, and it's not reflective listening. You called it the SAW model, SAW, stands for shame, avoidance, and withdrawal. And can you tell us the military basis for this? You pull from military language and experience and something that soldiers and warriors can understand.
Yeah, that was me really just optimizing something I had learned as a trauma psychologist, to be fair. So, when I was trained in how to do trauma therapy, all of the different approaches that work mean that people have to approach what they fear and approach what they would rather not. But I felt like in a lot of the descriptions of it, we were really staying in the language and culture that we are taught as healers and as therapists. And so all that I did was really think about what's a good analogy that military service members understand and could lock it in for them. And a SAW is a squad automatic weapon. It is a belt-fed machine gun, very powerful. All the infantry people and non-infantry, they would know what a SAW is. So It sits up on a tripod typically. And so using that concept, squad automatic weapon is a powerful weapon. I'm able to just translate the idea that shame is propped up by avoidance and withdrawal on the bottom of the tripod. So then the rationale for accelerating into discussions of what's at the root of the shame and really not avoiding it becomes a matter of something warriors do well, which is accelerate into challenge. If you can change it to that challenge is the hill for you to take, and you'll be stronger in the end by virtue of approaching what you would rather avoid, it is a powerful way to restructure the whole purpose of therapy and really engage our patients.
That's so interesting. You use another term that is a military term. You call something a sniper attack, and what you're talking about are these unwelcome bursts of anger. Can you talk a little bit about that analogy? I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that trauma does is it can make us feel like we're not even in control of our own bodies.
Right.
Right. So at a cellular level, if you feel like you can be ambushed or overrun by grief and trauma or have a panic attack, let's say there's a sexual assault. This is a little piece of what I added to this new edition. I'll give you a little preview here. The sexual assault recovery process is so hard because people feel like they've been violated because they have, and feel like they've lost control of their very bodies. And so they can have panic attacks and get triggered and just can't feel safe navigating the world. So treating that biological injury that's the result of trauma exposure can be a critical first step to treatment. And it's part of my work now to really advance biological innovations that if you put them before the therapy, allows you to get a totally different amount of traction with all of the therapy that you do after that.
So you really stress doing body work first. Let's talk about when you get warriors or first responders into a situation where you want to use the most effective strategy. What have you found that constitutes that?
Well, rather than a type of treatment, I have found a model for treatment, which is to address the biological stuff so they can get calm in their own body, and then find out what their goals and values are. I think otherwise, so often we can come with a menu of options. They feel missed in that process. And bringing them home from their military time of service, whether they deployed or not, is about bringing them into a relationship where they feel seen and witnessed and understood. And so to go back to an earlier part of our conversation, when we go in with standard, treatment protocols and questions that look for all the problems, challenges, diagnoses, deficits, it creates a relationship with them where they can feel like a number or passive recipient of treatment rather than really being empowered to go after personal growth.
So you use more of a group kind of setting so the soldiers have a bonding experience.
Yeah, I find that groups are actually more powerful with veterans if you seat a good dinner party. If you find the right people to put into that group and you shift in your relationship from being a one-on-one therapist, trying to work them through trauma or shame, often when they get into a unit, they can give each other space and freedom from the shame and the guilt. And they become the moral authority in each other's lives to remove that burden. And so our relationship as healers shifts to a facilitating role rather than being the, as you said, the solution or the savior. It's just a different model.
Huh. Wow. It reminds me of EMDR in some ways, like the therapist is shifting out of a role where they're leading, or like my wonderful interpretation is going to be what heals you. Instead, in EMDR, it's really your own mind. I like your word. You're facilitating growth. You're facilitating healing. You also talked about letter writing, which is something I have people do a lot. And you ask the soldiers, the warriors, to write letters to someone. It could be their younger selves. It could be a soldier that was fallen or killed themselves even. The recipient could be anyone or anything you wanted it to be. And then the next stage is to ask them to read those aloud to one another in the group. And I love this phrase you said. It becomes countercultural to take the easy path in the group.
Yeah. The minute one of them walks point, meaning takes the first risk and shares their letter, I've never had anybody kind of drop out of a group. Once that happens, there's that really good kind of peer pressure that helps people face directly the fox in their gut. And it's a really powerful treatment when done as a unit. But I also did find that EMDR was very helpful. I was actually trained. I was the only one for a space of time that had that training, trained by a retired colonel. And he gave me the gift of trust and said, you may need to adapt some of this. And so, go ahead and adapt it as you need to make it more helpful for your patients. So in the second edition of my book here, there's a section about adaptations I made to EMDR for the military and veteran population that have been really helpful for my patients.
Anybody who's listened to SelfWork a lot knows what EMDR is, but let's just say it. EMDR stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing Therapy. And it's a therapy that has been found to be very good for trauma and for healing trauma. So that's what we're talking about. Doc, let's talk about grief again. You brilliantly, I think, describe what I've seen so often in people who are grieving. They experience this, what you call burst of support. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, the burst of support effect is not just with grief, it's with really any big change. If there's a new baby or a car accident or somebody develops a cancer diagnosis, then what tends to happen is we tend to kind of give the support all in one burst and then go back to our normal lives. And the problem with that is that with grief, it really comes in waves over a very long period of time. And often there's a delayed reaction so that people will experience the most biting symptoms of their grief when they're most alone. Cards are no longer coming and people are no longer checking in with them. So it's just something we need to be aware of so that we can be intentional about changing if we want to support people who are traveling that grief journey.
The way I've thought about that in the past, because I guess I want to hang on to the idea that most human beings are actually trying to be decent and good, because certainly I've seen that support, that detachment, the tendency to support someone at the beginning, to be there for them, and then back way off. And I've wondered if it's about fear of losing control. And the fear becomes, maybe I'm going to have to grieve and really withstand or work through that grief. And it goes on for such a long time. And I don't like thinking about that. So I'm going to avoid that and just pretend that the person who got the divorce or whose partner died or was diagnosed with cancer or just came back from the war or whatever, I'm going to say, oh yeah, they're okay. They're doing fine.
You're right. It's about avoidance. We live in a very death avoidant culture, and a culture that doesn't, even in therapy circles, I find people are often reluctant and feel less than confident in their ability to walk with somebody in grief. And I really got a lot of additional helpful insights and a really clear model for how to grieve when I worked with Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. And so there are courses that were produced by the NFL Foundation through a company called Psych Armor that are free and available on grief and trauma and how to walk through grief after suicide loss and lots of topics that are free resources and may be of interest to some of your listeners.
Thanks for mentioning the Psych Armor. I'll actually have that link in the show notes for people. That sounds like a great resource. Gosh, there's so much. I've got several things still on my list, but I'm going to focus on two things. One is I don't really suggest that we go too theoretically into attachment, but what I would love for you to talk about is how you use the concept of attachment or secure, insecure, or avoidant attachment as a way of understanding. And by the way, you said you woke up at 3:00 and thought about this. And I noticed in the book you're up a lot at 3:00 in the morning. Painful.
I get some of my best ideas at 3 a.m, but I I wish I could sleep better, honestly.
I got a little concerned about you there, but I'm going to repeat what you figured out at 3:00 in the morning. And again, I've already said this earlier. What vets die for is what they would live to protect. And I'm going to say that again. A vet may want to die for what they have lived to protect. And this led you to a ritual which you suggest to people that I think could be very, very meaningful for anyone when they have darker thoughts or thoughts of harming themselves.
Yeah, so that realization that warfighters and I think other people in our society as well would live for what they would die to protect in battle is really important. And around that insight has come, a whole project that's called the Warrior Box Project, where warfighters can take an ammo can and fill it up with things that are tangible symbols of why they stay in the fight. The people and the values that they hold sacred. And it can work with their ownership of firearms, because what they can do is, put a key to their firearm lock or safe, if they have one of those, at the bottom of all the things that they say they would live for. And so that it becomes a deterrent to taking themselves out.
Again, I think this whole ritual would be something that anyone dealing with suicidal ideation would be moved by and hopefully stopped by. The Warrior Box. The last thing that I would love for you to mention is you talk about suicide as consequent to 3 different things: perceived burden, thwarted belonging, plus capacity.
And that's based on Thomas Joyner's interpersonal theory of suicide.
Oh, I was trying to give you credit for that.
Credit for something that's not mine. It's a really good explanatory model, I think. But what I added to it was to really map on to that model why I believe it's shame that's at the root of suicide more than depression. And how when we feel ashamed, we act out in our relationships, we do damaging behaviors, we withdraw. And so those central variables in Joyner's model, the thwarted belongingness, that's consequent to withdrawing and feeling like you're unworthy of belonging, right? So it just beautifully aligns with and maps onto a model that I've liked for a long time, and really explains why when you have all of that perfect storm of stress going on and access to a firearm that's very lethal, it can be turned to be a weapon for self-destruction from what its original intent for protection was meant to be.
I so get it, yes, but I'd never heard it before. I'm going to read it again for our listeners. Perceived burden, so that you feel your burden, that one I knew, plus thwarted belonging, like you don't, for some reason, something is getting in your way of feeling connected, you're more isolated. Then the third is you have the capacity to actually take your own life. So a firearm or something that you have is available to you that would kill you. Doc, this has been a wonderful time together. Is there anything else that you particularly want to say about the message of the book? I know you have a lot going on in the next little while. You have another edition of the book coming out, and SelfWork listeners would love to hear about that.
Thanks. Yeah, that was actually the last thing I'd love to share is that in this new edition of the book, there's a few new things. I talk a little bit more about sexual assault and why that's such a difficult and complicated recovery journey. I really don't think trauma is trauma. People say that and they mean well, but it's a different, multi-layered process of recovery with some traumas. I also included a lot of information about insights developed during this pandemic year that were perhaps from Warrior, but map on for all of us to understand how do we navigate trauma. What does leadership look like? How do we lead ourselves through times of disruptive change? How do we deal with helpless rage around the losses we've all seen in our jobs, our relationships, our ability to socialize, and so forth? And then there's also a bunch of new exercises in the book. And those are designed largely to help forge a deeper working trust between patients, any patients, and healers. So those are the big kind of updates that really made me want to expand my book Warrior and re-release it. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to come on and talk with you about some of the content of the book from before, now, and it's coming forward.
I want to stress to listeners that it may have sounded like this book was for therapists, or I may have made it sound like that, but it's not really. It's a book for the general public. Reading it as a therapist was very interesting, but it holds so many ideas and recommendations and suggestions for anyone who's been in the military, who is a warrior, who is a first responder, or for family members and loved ones of those folks. And actually just for all of us to try to understand what these people who put themselves in so much danger are facing. Yeah, I'm a psychologist, but I would have found this book interesting and really helpful to read in many, many ways, because we all know someone who's gone through or who's going through trauma. And as you said before, we've all been in a pandemic. We've all had our own fair share of trauma. I heard someone say the other day, we're all in the same ocean, but some of us have boats that are better built. But it is the same ocean. I want to thank you so much for your time. I've loved talking with you. And, this is Memorial Day weekend. And so this will be listened to then, but I'm sure it'll be listened to by a lot of people who are looking for answers. I so appreciate your wisdom.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for having me.
I hope Doc Springer's interview has made your Memorial Day even more special. I also want to let you know that I'm featuring Danica Thomas on Sunday with a second series of Careers That Kill. So we're doing double episodes of SelfWork here on Memorial Day weekend. So tune in on Sunday. Also, just to remind you, I created a course on depression, and Perfectly Hidden Depression is a part of that, for Himalaya.com. And if you go to Himalaya.com/depression, you'll find it. And if you use that link and the promo code OVERCOMING, then you can get 2 weeks free before you have to pay for any of their multiple presenters and teachers. Just wanted to remind you of that. Have a great weekend. Thanks for being here as always. Take very good care. I'm Dr. Margaret, and this has been SelfWork.